Welcome to this Killick Explains video on how to generate income. And this is number 3 in my 4-part series focusing on shares. So with no more ado, why am I talking about how to generate income? Well, pretty obviously, with inflation in double digits in early 2023 in the UK, as this video is being made, it's a bit of a battle to find ways of keeping up with the cost of living. And of course, there are people out there who will be either reducing work or stopping work, so they don't have an income from an employer or self-employment and need to find some way of replacing it. So where do shares fit in, if you like? Well, first of all, what are shares? Quick refresher. Shares are, in essence, your opportunity to part-own a business and to tap into the entrepreneurial drive and spirit that hopefully takes the economy forward in the future. All right, and that is the beauty of shares. No other instrument really gives you that direct access to all that energy and all those creative ideas. On top of that, they're structured in such a way that you can hold them for income, those are called dividends, and or capital growth, because shares hopefully go up, they can sometimes go down too. There are voting rights attached. Now that's not something that a lot of people prioritise necessarily, but unlike bonds, they do carry votes at annual general meetings, and they're relatively easy to understand, at least in the first instance. Most people get fairly comfortable with shares fairly quickly. So what are the advantages? Let's say you understand shares and you're sitting there nodding the other side of the screen, if you like. What are the advantages? Well, yields is one. Not all shares offer a dividend, but quite a few do. And dividend yields, if you hunt them down, can be quite attractive and can quite often beat inflation. So there's one aspect that people quite like. You can shelter shares within ISAs and SIPPs. Now that's true of some of the other things I've mentioned in other videos, like cash, like IOUs, for example, bonds, but shares are tax wrapper friendly, if you like. They have got the potential over the long term to beat inflation. Now, I can't make that as a claim right now sitting here, but if you look historically at various influential studies showing the return available on UK shares, traditionally it has been inflation beating. They're fairly liquid. That means you can sell them quickly. Not always a good idea, by the way, but it is possible. And they're relatively straightforward to understand. I'm not going to say that making money in shares is really easy, because otherwise everyone would be doing it all the time, but they're relatively straightforward instruments. Now, what are the downsides? Okay, number one, and people will realise this in the last couple of years, volatility. Shares go down as well as up, and some of them do it fairly quickly. Now, managing short-term volatility, not getting distracted by it, is one of the skills of being a long-term equity investor, but nonetheless, you need to be aware of it as a first-timer in particular. On top of that, dividends can be a great source of income, but they can also be cut and they can also be reduced. Companies do not have to pay dividends, whereas they do normally have to pay bondholders their coupons, for example. There is bankruptcy risk, and if that happens to a company, then shareholders go right to the bottom of the heap, or close to it, in terms of getting their money back, okay? And allowances, tax-free allowances outside of the tax shelters I mentioned, are being reduced by the current government bit by bit, one of them being the annual dividend allowance, all right? So things to watch out for, there. So what are the rules? How do you do this thing successfully? Once you understand shares and you're aware of the pitfalls, how do you actually make some money from them potentially? One is diversify. Do not punt on single stocks, either for growth or for income. That's a no-no. So spread your risk around. Don't focus solely on income. Income generators can be expensive. Everyone wants them. It can be a crowded trade, as they say. So don't exclusively think the only way to generate income from shares is dividends. There are other ways to do it, drawdown strategies and so on, that might be more cost effective. Do your homework on yields. Don't assume companies will carry on paying them. If you've heard of expressions like dividend cover, either earnings or cash flow based, that's quite a useful thing to know about. Look for consistency and look for management commitment. Find out, are management truly committed to this dividend, or is it a kind of one-off bribe, if you like? And as I say, if you've not come across cover calculations in the past, worth at least understanding the basics. How many times could the company afford to pay this thing out of the earnings or cash flow available? Now, where do shares fit into the 3 buckets I've talked about in other videos? I would say, as an emergency fund, no. Do not use a share portfolio as a cash point. That's a bad idea because of the short-term volatility issue I've mentioned. Those foreseeable calls on capital may be in some instances for part of the solution, but rarely is that going to be the full solution, because with foreseeable calls on capital, you know roughly when you need the money, you know how much, so you need to have some certainty over when you're going to get your cash back, if you like. And for long-term wealth building, definitely. Shares work best when they're left to cook, as it were, left to simmer over the long term, ride out those periods of volatility, reinvest dividends if you can afford to do that. That is potentially the happy space. Now, I've condensed a massive topic into a short video here, so for further information, my video library is killik.com/learn, and there is a shares tab in there. You can read all about it in Confidant. That's normally got a bit of meat on shares at the front end, some research detail there for those people who want it. And then one of my guides is all about how to invest in equities. It's a kind of beginner's guide, if you like, but that would be editor@killik.com.